Over the past few years, schools have been caught right in the middle of the culture wars. We've heard parents protesting school closures during the pandemic. School board members have argued about race in curriculum in debates about critical race theory.
Not in our schools.
It is in our school.
Show me in the curriculum where CRT that
all you have to do is go to social media, sir. All you have to do is go to social media.
Our curriculum where CRT is.
Okay.
Because we don't even have a definition for it.
Some states, like Florida, have gotten rid of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. Here's Florida's Republican Governor Ron DeSantis speaking at a press conference in May of last year.
This bill says the whole experiment with DEI is coming to an end in the state of Florida. We are eliminating the DEI programs. We are going to treat people as individuals. We're not going to treat people as members of groups.
And now, when it comes to education policy at the federal level, President-elect Donald Trump is proposing something radical.
One of his biggest proposals has been to eliminate the Department of Education, which has a lot of people very alarmed.
One other thing I'll be doing very early in the administration is closing up the Department of Education in Washington, D.C.
I think that's probably not real likely given the politics of that situation and what it would take to actually do it. But that's not his only idea. He has other things that would be very doable.
Laura Meckler is a national education reporter for The Post. She says even if getting rid of an entire department does not happen, just talking about it at this level sends a big message. Laura has also been covering the other ways education could be reshaped under the second Trump administration, including big cuts to spending and what schools teach.
He's threatened to cut federal funding for any school that teaches about race issues in a way that he doesn't like or that talks about transgender students in ways that he doesn't like. So a lot of his proposals, if they follow through with them, could be quite far-reaching.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Elahe Izadi. It's Tuesday, November 19th. Today, how Trump could use the presidency to push his education agenda, and what it would take for him to actually shut down the Department of Education. So, Laura, before we get to what it would take to shut down the Department of Education, let's talk about what it does. What is under the Department of Education's purview? What is it responsible for?
Sure. So on the K-12 side, one of the big things it does is administers a couple really big grant programs and a bunch of small ones. The big ones are the Title I program, which provides supplemental funding for high poverty schools. And then there's a program that helps pay for the cost of educating students with disabilities. So these are multi-billion-dollar programs that are very important to a lot of school districts all around the country. Maybe every school district benefits in some way from the students with disability funding. So that's one thing that it does. The second thing that it does is it enforces civil rights laws. It's against the law to discriminate if you're a federally funded school on the basis of age, sex, race, national origin, other factors. So the Department of Education is the one who actually investigates schools to see if they are, in fact, discriminating on those grounds. And those investigations can look very different depending on what your point of view is. And then the third thing, which is actually probably the biggest and most important thing it does, is it administers the federal student loan program. That's a $1.6 trillion program.
So what's the backstory of the Department of Education? Has it always been around?
It was created in 1979. President Carter created it. It was something that he had promised the National Education Association, the big teachers union, that he would do, and he followed through on that promise. And right from the beginning, we started hearing calls for getting rid of it.
The budget plan I submit to you on February 8th will realize major savings by dismantling the Departments of Energy and Education and by eliminating ineffective subsidies for business.
Ronald Reagan talked about it. He was, the first president to actually preside over the Department of Education, and he wanted to get rid of it. the current incarnation of the Republican Party has focused a lot on the culture war issues, and the education department is sometimes on the forefront of those. So we do hear some people who don't like the way the education department has been used in terms of pressuring schools, for instance, to give transgender students rights in school, for one, or how they deal with issues of race. So there's that tension as well.
Okay, so what is Trump's argument for getting rid of it?
He haven't necessarily made a completely coherent case, but some of the arguments that we hear about it from him and others include, one, it hasn't been effective, that essentially we still have lots of kids who are not reading on grade level, who are struggling in math. And we've had this agency now for, 40 years and it isn't working. So it's time to do something different. That's one argument. Another argument is that it's just too much federal bureaucracy. We should be shrinking the footprint of Washington. And education is something that really belongs to state and local authorities, which is, in fact, where most of the education decisions are made. And then the third is that the current education department is overly woke and pushing a liberal agenda.
Okay, so as you're saying, most education decisions are actually made at the state and local level. That's not something the Department of Education in D.C. is doing. But what about funding for schools? Where does that money come from?
The money comes from state and local governments also. About 90% of all funding for schools comes from state and local governments. In each state, it's a different balance between state and local, and it depends on the district sometimes, how much is state and how much is local. But about 90% is state and local, and then that other 10% comes from the feds.
Okay, so let's talk about what the impact of shutting down the Department of Education would be. Let's put aside for a moment, we'll get to it, the likelihood, but let's just say Trump has his way, the department is eliminated. What would the impact be?
Well, it would depend. Under one scenario, and this is what is outlined under Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation's conservative blueprint for what a Trump administration or another conservative administration might look like, what it talks about is farming out all of the different pieces of the education department to other agencies. So, for instance, you could have the federal student loan program run by the Treasury Department. You could have the Office for Civil Rights run by the Justice Department. The grant programs could go to HHS. That is one scenario. So you could argue that everything would just still happen, but just in a much more piecemeal fashion. One result of that, we should say, would be that education would no longer have the same kind of seat at the table that it has now. You wouldn't have a cabinet secretary focused on this issue. You would not have it have the same prominence. And some of that is symbolic and some of that is real.
Can you speak to the beyond the symbolic impact? What does it actually mean to have that seat at the table?
Well, I think it matters because, you're thinking about who has the access to the president, who has the ability to raise an issue, who has the clout to get that meeting, who has the ability to get on TV to talk about things that matter. All of those things you're just in a much more elevated role. And you might think that that's just a small thing, but I actually think that's kind of a big thing. And in fact, it's to some extent, the reason why some people would like to get rid of the agency. They say that this is just a way to get special interests, get more attention. Say teachers' unions have somewhere they can go. They can go to the Department of Education to press their perspective. If you don't have one agency, then, where do they go? Well, it's kind of all scattered around. So it does have an important function.
And then what about the student loan program? You said that is a major part of the department's work. And if the idea is to potentially farm that out to Treasury, what would happen to the people who borrow through it now?
Well, it would just depend how it changed. I mean, theoretically, the system could work in the same way, but there are other things around that program that likely would change. So one of the things that's probably less understood is that in order to participate in the federal student loan program, you have to follow certain federal rules, and the Education Department sets those rules. So for instance, in the last several years, there's been controversy over for-profit schools that have popped up that have been a sort of fly-by-night, not done a good job, not had good outcomes for their students. Well, the Education Department has shut those down by essentially saying that they don't qualify for the federal student loan program anymore. So that's a very powerful tool that the Education Department has that they exert through their authority with this federal student loan program. They don't directly control schools, but they do control who accesses this money. Could all of that move to Treasury? Theoretically it could, but we don't really know exactly how they would go about it. Because, the Treasury Department doesn't wake up every morning thinking about education and colleges. They have a whole lot of other agenda. And that's, I think, what we are talking about having an agency purely focused on this.
I also wonder if there are some schools that, like you said, this 90% figure, that 90% of funding for schools comes from state and local governments. But are there some schools that rely much more on federal government than state and local?
Yeah, some schools are definitely more reliant than others. And, it should be said that even with the Department of Education open, Trump has said that he wants to drastically cut education spending. And that's a spot where that could happen. So you could theoretically seriously impact those schools with a functioning agency, but one that was handing out a lot less money.
So I'm wondering, how are teachers, educators, parents? I mean, it's such a massive group of people. They probably don't all feel the same way. But when they hear this news, how are people feeling about it, Laura, in your reporting? What are you hearing?
I hear a lot of anxiety around this issue. Some people, I would say the people who are maybe more conservative might say, oh, this isn't really going to happen. It's just sort of another thing. They sort of dismiss it. But I also hear anxiety from others who are like, what? He's going to do what? I think that there's this visceral reaction because it basically sends a message that, like, I don't care about education. I mean, I think that's how people read it. And whether that's what he intends or not, I can't say. But I think people do care about education in this country. They care about it a lot. And the idea that the federal government would be even talking about stepping back from its support of education, I think is alarming to some. Now, there are also others, of course, who think the federal government's too big and is doing too much. And those folks are probably, cheering for this idea.
After the break, what it would take to close the Department of Education. We'll be right back. So, Laura, I want to go back to the likelihood or unlikelihood of whether Donald Trump can just get rid of the Department of Education. So can you just walk me through what would need to happen if, on day 1 or day 30, Donald Trump says, I want to get rid of this Department of Education? What does he have to do?
Well, he has to get it through Congress. This is the short answer. Presidents cannot just create or disband federal agencies with a wave of the wand. This is something that was an agency that was created by Congress, and Congress would have to go along with getting rid of it. So I think that we should expect that one of Trump's allies, a Republican or a group of Republicans, will introduce legislation to do this. It may get some hearings, and it may just die there. Or I could see the House bringing it up for a vote. Now, this was voted on last year, and it failed because it didn't have enough Republican support. In addition to having unanimous Democratic opposition, there were 60 Republicans who voted no. Now, this was a one-sentence bill that just said the education department will close, pretty much, period. So you could make the argument that that was not exactly a well-thought-through plan. And also, it didn't have Donald Trump out there pushing people. Now, when you get to the Senate, the rules in the Senate say that you need 60 votes to pass a measure, and Republicans are not going to have 60 votes. And I don't know a single Senate Democrat who would vote for this.
So with Donald Trump coming into office, if he is unable to eliminate the Department of Education entirely, what are some of the other things that the Trump administration could do to advance its goals in influencing and shaping and remaking how education is done in this country?
Well, there are a few things that I think are on the horizon, and I think all of these things are much more likely to happen than closing the department. Number one is he could propose significant budget cuts to the department, which would have an impact on the schools that receive that money. We certainly will see him put an end to President Biden's debt forgiveness program for higher education. That's already been challenged in court, and there's no doubt in my mind that that is going away. I think that he will push a school voucher program, which would also need to be approved by Congress, but it could be done with a majority in the Senate because it's a money thing. So I think that we'll see that on the something that he's pushing as well. And within the Department of Education, I think that what you'll see is just as the Biden administration has used the powers of the Civil Rights Office to try to advance a progressive agenda, I think we'll see the Trump administration use those powers to try to press a conservative agenda. So that, for instance, might look like, whereas Biden ordered schools to not discriminate against students based on their gender identity. So that meant giving transgender students, say, access to bathrooms and locker rooms that corresponded with their gender identity. I think what you might see is the opposite from the Trump administration. They would say that when you allow a transgender girl into a girls' locker room, then that is discrimination against the other girls who are in there, and that is against the law. That's against civil rights law. So we might see a complete 180 using the same powers to try to push schools in the opposite direction.
And what about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion? Trump has been very critical of DEI initiatives, like even more broadly. And I'm wondering what influence could his administration have over that, or even just how race comes up in schools?
I am definitely going to be watching for this. I think that it's very possible that they will try to have an influence on this. Now, as we talked about, curriculum are set at the state and local level. But that said, there are definitely people close to the incoming administration who are making the case that if a school is teaching something like about systemic racism or white privilege, or they're doing things like having an affinity group for Black teachers or a program that's geared at particular students of color, that all of that is a violation of the requirement that you not discriminate on the basis of race, and that they could go after those schools for doing that. I think that there's a pretty good likelihood that we might see something along those lines.
What does that actually look like? What could happen to teachers who get caught in the crosshairs here?
Well, the federal government wouldn't have any direct power over teachers. If, Washington doesn't fire or hire teachers, but the school district itself could be found out of compliance with civil rights law. They would be forced to essentially reach some sort of agreement with the Office for Civil Rights, which typically involves promises to do better, to change policies, to be monitored. And, theoretically, the threat that hangs out there is that if you don't come into a compliance, we could cut off your federal funding.
Well, I would imagine, even if a teacher themselves wouldn't be punished by the federal government, could this just create a chilling effect for teachers?
It could. It could. I mean, if the Trump administration gets out there with a loud bully pulpit and says, hey, school districts out there coast to coast, if you do X, Y, or Z, we will investigate you. We will come after you. Then yes, it could have a chilling effect for sure.
Laura, as we're seeing Donald Trump unveil who he wants to be in his cabinet, these picks are telling us a lot about how he wants his government to run. What are you hearing about who he might pick for the Department of Education, a department he wants to get rid of?
Yeah, I think he will nominate a secretary, even though he theoretically does want to get rid of this department. We're hearing a wide range of names, some sort of establishment figures like Virginia Fox, who is the chairwoman of the House Education Committee. Everything from that to Tiffany Justice, who is the co-founder of Moms for Liberty, which has been a real frontline culture war organization on the right. I've heard the names of a handful of state school superintendents, some of whom you probably, and our listeners probably haven't heard of, like Cade Brumley from Louisiana. He's somebody who a lot of people like. So that's a lower profile person, but he's someone who's really been involved on the front lines of education. So, there's a range of choices out there.
Yeah, well, we'll have to keep watching and see who he picks. Laura, one other thing that I keep wondering about is how a second Trump term could be similar or different from the first Trump term. So I'm just wondering if you have any final thoughts on how education could be different this time around and what we can learn from the first term.
It's so interesting because the first time around, Donald Trump really didn't care about education. I mean, by all accounts, he spent very little time, almost no energy on this subject. And that was evident in many, many ways. It was just something that he didn't pay attention to. And his education secretary, Betsy DeVos, her point of view was different than the one we've been talking about in terms of a conservative activist agency. Her point of view was a very sort of traditional conservative view, which was the federal government should have a light footprint. This isn't their job. It's up to the state and local governments to set curriculum. Even policy. She really was loath to push too hard in any direction. Now, she was rolling back the liberal stuff, but she wasn't pushing conservative stuff in the same way that we hear about the incoming administration trying to do. So it was very different in the first administration. I think we're going to see a much more activist education agenda this time around.
Well, Laura, thank you so much for joining and explaining all this.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation.
Laura Meckler is a national education reporter for The Post. Before I go, here are two other stories my colleagues at The Post are closely following. First, a Hong Kong court on Tuesday sentenced 45 pro-democracy leaders to harsh prison terms. The 45 include the city's most prominent activists. The shortest sentence anyone received was 4 years and 2 months in prison. The longest was 10 years. They were arrested during a single day in February 2021. They were charged with, quote, conspiracy to commit subversion, for taking part in an unofficial primary election. Amelia Wong is the partner of one of the activists. She spoke to the Associated Press about the sentencing.
Of course, it will silence more people because you see how a primary can be illegal and lead to 10 years of sentencing. So, of course, it will silence more people.
The prison sentences underscore the repression Hong Kong has faced from China since massive pro-democracy protests took place 5 years ago. And here in the U.S., Western states are bracing for an atmospheric river and potential bomb cyclone in the coming days, meaning a lot of rain and wind. An atmospheric river is a narrow band of tropical moisture. It delivers warmth from around the equator to the poles. Forecasters predict this one will be supersized by a bomb cyclone, which is a rapidly intensifying low-pressure system. All this could bring as much as 20 inches of rain in the mountainous regions and 6 inches from the Washington-Oregon border to Northern California. The storm could lead to landslides and power outages. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. If you're looking for the latest updates on the big news of the day, check out our morning news briefing, The 7. You'll get the 7 stories you need to know about every weekday morning by 7 a.m. You can listen to it wherever you listen to podcasts. Today's show was produced by Sabby Robinson with help from Bishop Sand. It was mixed by Justin Garish and edited by Monica Campbell with help from Allison McAdam, Maggie Penman, and Lucy Perkins. Thanks to Chastity Pratt. I'm Elahe Izadi. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.